Norman Rogers was a man with a deep gaze, marked by the experiences of a long, intense life. He grew up in a forgotten small town, where dust and heat were constant, and hard work was the only way to secure the basics. Luxury and comfort were foreign to his childhood. After the early loss of his father, Norman took on the responsibility of supporting his mother and siblings, working tirelessly to put food on the table and ensure they didn't go without. Over the years, Norman left his hometown in search of something greater. Determined to build a better life, he went from being a street vendor to owning one of the most well-known supermarket chains in the state. Each achievement was marked by sleepless nights, tough decisions, and incalculable sacrifice. He deeply loved his wife, who supported him from the beginning, but she passed away early, leaving Norman with the challenge of raising their 3 children, who, as they grew, drifted away from the values he held so dear. For Norman, hard work and respect for others were a person's greatest virtues. However, when he looked at his grown children, he felt a silent sadness seeing those values seemed forgotten. Emily, the eldest, was obsessed with status and shopping. Marcus, the middle child, chased quick business ventures, unconcerned with the impact of his actions. Ethan, the youngest, lived a life of luxury on his father's money, never having worked a single day. At 78, Norman felt he was nearing the end of his journey, but something deeply troubled him. He had achieved everything a man could desire: wealth, recognition, and a family. Yet seeing his children stray so far from the values that defined him left him questioning if he had truly created a legacy worth leaving behind. During a dinner at his home, Norman, seated at the head of the table, observed his children talking, their laughter and shared looks suggesting harmony. But the words of Emily, Marcus, and Ethan cut him like a knife. "Honestly, I think I deserve the lake house. It's the least Dad could leave me, considering all I've done for him," Emily said, her tone hinting at some unspoken personal sacrifice. "Done? Emily? You only show up on holidays to take pictures." Marcus shot back, irritated. "Besides, the lake house isn't even worth as much as the city apartment. Frankly, I think Ethan and I should get the investments." Ethan, the youngest and probably the least interested in family responsibilities, smiled as he sliced a piece of meat. "Relax. I've already spoken to Dad's lawyer, and he said there are funds we can split without any issue. Everyone gets their share. Simple as that." Norman watched in silence, struggling to contain the anguish swelling in his chest. He had given everything he had: support, guidance, and, most importantly, love. But right there, in front of him, were 3 people who seemed to have missed the true meaning of it all. His children, for whom he'd sacrificed so much, seemed more interested in his wealth than in his presence. What hurt him most was realizing that none of them bothered to ask about his health or memories. They didn't see the tired, sad look in his eyes that night. Worse yet, they were so blinded by ambition they didn't notice their own father's suffering. When dinner ended, and his children continued discussing material possessions, Norman stood up. They paused and looked at him, not with genuine interest, just a passing curiosity about what he might do. "I'm going to retire, kids. I need to reflect on a few things," he said quietly, his voice calm. No one offered to help. Emily murmured a good night, while Marcus and Ethan waved casually, resuming their conversation. As he climbed the stairs, Norman felt a tightness in his chest. A single tear escaped his eye, but he quickly wiped it away, determined not to let disappointment take hold. The man who had faced countless hardships and built a life of success now felt defeated, not by money or business, but by the emptiness in his children's hearts. That night, Norman lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind restless. He knew he needed to act, but facing the fact that he had raised a family more focused on material wealth than his presence was a hard pill to swallow. In the silence of the night, an idea began to form in his mind. Perhaps there was still a way to open his children's eyes to what truly mattered in life. It would be risky and painful, but he knew he couldn't leave this world without at least trying. The next morning, Norman awoke with a new determination. The sadness from the previous night still lingered, but now it mingled with a firm resolve. He had spent years building that life and carefully raising his family. If he had failed to pass on the true meaning of what he'd built, there was still one last chance to change everything. Norman Rogers picked up the phone and called Walter Mason, his trusted friend and lawyer of over 40 years. The familiar voice on the other end of the line brought him a sense of calm and steadiness. "Walter, I need you to come to my house today. It's important, and it can't wait," Norman said, his tone conveying the urgency of his request. "Of course, Norman. I'll be there within an hour," Walter replied, already sensing the seriousness of the situation. As he waited, Norman looked around his impressive home. The walls were adorned with paintings by renowned artists, and the marble floors reflected the soft light pouring through the large windows. But at that moment, all that luxury felt empty, like a hollow shell. Without purpose, all that comfort was nothing more than an empty structure. When Walter arrived, Norman welcomed him into his study, an elegant room with carved wood bookshelves filled with books, and a lit fireplace breaking the room's silence. Seeing the worn expression on his friend's face, Walter immediately sensed that something had profoundly changed in Norman. "Norman, what happened?" Walter asked, his face full of concern. Norman took a deep breath and began describing what he had witnessed at dinner with his children the night before. Each word held a restrained sadness and deep disappointment. Walter listened attentively, not interrupting, fully understanding the pain this man he knew so well was going through. "Walter, I can't leave this world with my children in this state. They need to understand the value of everything I've built. I want them to learn what it's like to depend on themselves, just as I once had to," Norman said, resolute. Walter listened in respectful silence, concerned yet understanding that Norman was preparing for a profound and possibly painful decision. "So, what do you have in mind?" the lawyer asked. "A new will. I want most of my fortune donated to a foundation that supports seniors who, like me, devoted their lives to their families and find themselves alone. My children will receive a symbolic inheritance, just enough for them to start fresh, but without the privileges they've always had. I want them to work hard, earn what they want instead of simply expecting a fortune they didn't earn." Walter observed him silently for a moment, impressed by the clarity and courage in his friend's words. He knew how much this decision cost Norman emotionally, but sensed that this was something he needed to do to find peace. "I can draft the will for you, Norman, but are you absolutely sure of this decision? This choice will change the course of their lives forever," Walter said thoughtfully. Norman nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm sure, Walter. I want my children to understand that the greatest inheritance they can carry is the dignity of building something on their own. I don't want them to become prisoners of greed. I'd rather they experience what it's like to face life on their own, as I once did, so they can become better people." That morning, Walter stayed with Norman, drafting every detail of the new will, including the specific clauses. When the document was finished, Walter handed it to Norman to sign, which he did without hesitation. After signing, Walter placed the will in his briefcase and prepared to leave. Before he left, he put a hand on his friend's shoulder and looked at him with empathy and respect. "You're a brave man, Norman. I hope your children will one day understand the value of this gesture." Norman managed a faint smile and thanked him. He knew his decision would be devastating for his children, but he believed that this pain was necessary. He knew he might not live to see the result, but he hoped that one day his children would understand the lesson he was trying to leave behind. That same night, alone at home, Norman sat in his favorite armchair and looked at a family photo above the fireplace. It was an old photo from a time when his children were still young, and he and his wife had great hopes for their family's future. He felt a mix of nostalgia and tranquility, as if he had done everything within his reach. A few days later, Norman called his children for a special dinner, asking them to reserve the evening to be together. Unaware of their father's plan, Emily, Marcus, and Ethan agreed to come. During the dinner, Norman watched them with a calm and reflective gaze. He didn't mention anything about the new will or his decision. Instead, he took the time to laugh, share memories of their childhood, and rekindle a bit of the connection that once existed between them. They parted on a cordial note, not realizing it would be their last family gathering before their lives changed completely. A few weeks later, Norman passed away peacefully in his home. True to his promise, Walter informed the children about the will and scheduled a reading. They attended, still grieving, but with high expectations of the inheritance they imagined would be divided among them. As the lawyer began reading the document, their expressions shifted from expectation to shock and then to anger. Donated to a charity foundation? What does that mean? Emily cried out in disbelief, while Marcus tried to make sense of the situation, and Ethan remained silent, pale, and stunned. Walter kept a steady tone as he explained each clause of the will. To receive a symbolic inheritance, the children would need to find jobs, support themselves, and leave behind the luxuries they'd always taken for granted. Only after 5 years of hard work and effort would they have access to the rest of the inheritance. The revelation struck the three like an unexpected blow, unraveling what they'd taken as certain about their future. Emily, Marcus, and Ethan shifted from initial outrage to a heavy silence that gradually gave way to introspection. Each began to reflect on what they had truly lost. Not the fortune, but Norman's presence, the father who had tried to give them a secure life and who, perhaps, they had valued less than the wealth he built. This inheritance wasn't about money. In leaving, Norman had given them something greater, the opportunity to redefine their own worth. In the months that followed, their lives turned upside down. In addition to grief, they faced the challenges of a life without the privileges that had shielded them from responsibility. Each was led down a path of hardship where they had to learn, often through pain, what it meant to live in the real world. Emily, used to luxurious vacations and a life of comfort, was the hardest hit. After months of unsuccessful job searches, she finally accepted a position as an assistant at a community clinic. The job involved dealing with patients and families, often in vulnerable situations. There, she began to see the weight of life stories, the strength of people facing challenges without the guarantees that had always surrounded her. Over time, her resentment transformed into a new understanding of life and what her father had intended by leaving her in this position. For the first time, she felt connected to something bigger than her own comfortable existence. Marcus, who had always rejected ordinary jobs, had to swallow his pride. After countless interviews, he ended up working at an auto shop, where he found himself, day after day, doing heavy, physical work. The exhaustion was visible at the end of each day, but he began to appreciate the value of discipline and perseverance. Gradually, the sense of accomplishment after each repair brought a sense of purpose he'd never known. He felt a direct connection to his father's world and came to deeply respect the lessons Norman had tried to impart, seeing the wisdom in his decision. Ethan, the youngest and most carefree, had always lived as though time were at his disposal. With no other choice, he took a job at a local coffee shop, serving and cleaning tables. At first, the work felt insignificant and tiring, but he soon began to notice the routines of people around him, people who, despite their struggles, found meaning in their daily lives. Inspired by one of the regular customers, he decided to enroll in a graphic design course. For the first time, he felt motivated to build something of his own. The emptiness he had felt for so long began to fade, replaced by a new perspective on the value of life. 5 years passed. The greed and resentment the three siblings initially harbored were replaced by humility, respect, and even camaraderie. From siblings who merely coexisted, they became true brothers and sisters, with bonds strengthened by the experiences each had lived. Together, they shared their stories, rediscovering the value of simplicity and family moments. Then they received a call from Walter for the final reading of the will. Sitting together, they awaited the outcome of an inheritance that no longer carried the same weight in their hearts. "You have fulfilled the conditions your father set," Walter said with a respectful smile. "Now, he leaves you his fortune, along with the hope that you understand the lesson he wished to convey." Moved, they listened with tears in their eyes. The money no longer held the same importance. To them, it was almost an irony. They had discovered that the true wealth lay in resilience and learning what it meant to live with dignity. That night, the three went to dinner together to honor Norman. This time, The conversation was not about what they owned, but about the father who had guided them to a new reality. They felt Norman's presence almost tangibly, and for the first time, they understood the depth of the love he had left behind. They raised their glasses, deeply touched. "To Dad, who taught us to see life as it truly is," Emily said, smiling through her tears. In that moment, they realized that, though absent, Norman was still alive in each of them, and the inheritance he left would live on forever. The legacy of a life filled with meaning. If this story touched you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs a reminder of what truly matters.